The warm wind from the savannah slowly touched the leaves of the trees, whistled through their branches, and it seemed that the very land of Africa breathed life. The sand swirling at his feet flew apart as the old car, with difficulty overcoming potholes, rolled along a narrow, abandoned road. The wheels slipped on the clay surface, but the surfer, ignoring the irregularities, confidently held the steering wheel. Samu was sitting in the back seat, silently looking out the window. Fields and mountains stretched for miles, and the savannah seemed to merge with the sky, disappearing on the horizon. He grew up here, in the heart of African nature, and knew every corner of his native places. He didn't need to look at the landscapes, he knew them by heart. But today something else was bothering his soul. In the front seat, right in front of him, sat the gang, the woman who had recently become his stepmother. She was not like those he had known before, not at all like his mother. Tall, slender, with skin the color of burnt earth, the gang radiated confidence and strength. Her long braids were neatly arranged on her shoulders, and her eyes, dark and deep, like lakes on a moonless night, looked straight ahead into nowhere. Samu couldn't take his eyes off her. It seemed to him that her every gesture, every movement of her hand or turn of her head attracted his attention like a magnet. She had barely spoken to him since she arrived at their house. Kefila's father was happy it was enough for Samu not to ask questions. He respected his father, his choices and decisions. But there was something about this woman that made him uneasy, as if there was more to her calm, impenetrable exterior, something that pulled him despite all the inhibitions of his mind. They had been driving for several hours, and the road seemed endless. Samu suddenly realized that he had no idea where they were going. My father said something about a business trip, that they needed to settle some important issues away from their village, but the essence of the conversation slipped from his memory. He was not used to delving into his father's affairs, preferring to keep an eye on the household and his studies. But now, sitting here, next to the gang, far from home, Samu began to feel a tension that he had not known before. Her silence weighed on him, and every kilometer of the road only intensified this feeling. Sometimes she turned her head and glanced at him briefly, as if trying to say something, but she couldn't find the right words. He was silent too. An inner voice told him that now was not the time to speak. It was as if an invisible thread stretched between them, stretched to the limit, but neither of them dared to pull it first. The car braked sharply, forcing her to break away from her thoughts. The driver got out, looked around, then, without saying a word, went to the house that stood on the edge of the road. It was an old house built in the time of his grandfathers. Samu knew his story. A place for meetings, for secret deals and private conversations. My father often used this house when he wanted to be alone or solve problems away from prying eyes. But now the house was quiet. Even the wind seemed to have died down, giving way to something bigger, intangible. Samu got out of the car, and immediately the hot air hit his face. He looked back at the gang, who were also slowly coming out, their movements precise and graceful. She looked at him, and for a split second their eyes met. It wasn't just a look, it was something more. In that brief moment he felt his heart racing.
You know this place well,
the gang finally said. Her voice was deep, rich, like thick honey. She did not look at him. Her gaze was fixed on the distance, but Samu felt that she was talking to him for him. He nodded, unable to find the strength to say a word. It seemed that the air between them was electrified. Each of her words awakened something new in him, hitherto unknown.
It's always been quiet here. The silence is oppressive, isn't it?
She continued, turning her dark eyes back to him. There was something predatory in that look, but not frightening. Rather, it is alluring. It was as if she was waiting for an answer from him, some kind of confession. But Samu was silent again, trying to keep his distance, although this distance seemed to be getting smaller with each passing moment. They entered the house. It was cool inside, despite the heat outside. The clay walls absorbed the heat of the day, leaving only cool streams of air inside. She had known this house since childhood, and had been here more than once. But now everything seemed different, alien, as if even the walls breathed something new. The gang stopped at the window, looking out at the garden that had grown behind the house. She stood in complete silence, only occasionally straightening her long braids. Samu sat down on a low wooden chair, watching her from the shadow cast by one of the pillars. Her silhouette against the bright sunlight seemed almost ephemeral, like a mirage in the desert, but at the same time so real that he was drawn to her like a magnet. He knew he couldn't look at her like that. It was wrong. But he couldn't stop himself. Father. Thinking about him sobered him, reminding him that this was his father's wife. But the gang was not like other women, and Samu felt it all over his skin. She turned to him as if she sensed his gaze, and a faint smile flickered across her face. There was something strange about her, elusive, but at the same time hypnotizing. She came closer, closing the distance between them step by step, her bare feet treading softly on the stone floor.
Your father trusts me,
she said softly, as if it were a secret that no one else could hear.
He believes that I can take care of you.
Samu felt his body tense up. Every muscle in his body was stretched like a string, ready to snap at any second.
But what if I don't live up to that trust?
She continued, her voice almost a whisper.
What if we both fail him?
These words echoed in his mind, and he suddenly realized that he couldn't hold back any longer. Time pulled them together like the currents of two rivers that one day would merge into one. It's been a few weeks since the gang entered into life itself. Their days were filled with the usual routine, working on the land, taking care of the household, solving everyday tasks. But there was something more hidden under this surface. It seemed that every day brought with it an invisible tension that grew and accumulated like a thunderstorm hanging in the air. Kefila's father was still in their house, but he spent more and more time traveling, taking care of things that he had never been interested in himself. All that mattered to him was his home, his personal space which the gang had now taken over. One evening Kefila returned home with the news. He said that he had to go on a long trip urgently. The case was related to business, and it required his immediate presence. My father spoke confidently, and as always without unnecessary emotions. Sami was not used to asking questions, he just nodded, accepting this news as an inevitable part of their lives. But when he heard his father's words, he felt an inner unease that he had not noticed before. The gang was sitting nearby. Her calmness seemed impenetrable, but Samu felt that she took the news differently. Her gaze lingered on him for a moment, but she didn't say anything. Kefila, having collected the necessary things, said goodbye to them, as always, simply and without unnecessary words. Samu walked him to his car, and standing on the threshold, watched his father drive away in the dusty distance of the road. When the car disappeared over the horizon, silence settled in the house. Everything has changed since what moment? A week has passed. The days passed slowly, like sand in a clock. Samu plunged into his work, trying to distract himself from the thoughts that were circling in his head. He tended the cattle, checked the paddocks and took care of the plants in the garden, but every time he returned to the house, his gaze involuntarily searched for the gang. Now that they were alone, without their father's presence, the tension between them was almost palpable. They rarely spoke to each other. The gang, as always, kept their distance, but their presence was so powerful that it was impossible to ignore it. She moved through the house with grace, as if she didn't notice him, but she knew that every step she took was full of conscious caution. It was as if she always felt him next to her, even when her back was to him. Whenever their gazes accidentally met, he felt a strange excitement that he couldn't explain. One evening, when the sun was already setting and the air was filled with coolness, Samu heard a storm coming. The sky quickly became overcast with grey clouds which began to spin, menacingly thickening over the house. Thunderstorms were not uncommon in Africa, but this one seemed unusually strong. The air became heavy and humid, the wind increased, and soon the first drops of rain were heard outside the windows. Samu was busy locking the cattle in the pens when gusts of wind began to shake the wooden doors. He raised his head to the sky and saw lightning cutting through the dark clouds, illuminating the savannah for a few moments. The storm was coming fast, and he had to hurry. When he returned to the house, he saw the gang standing at the window. She silently watched the storm break out, not moving. When he entered, their eyes met, and that look was long. Not a word was said, but something in their silence said more than words could express. Samu came closer, and at that moment there was a deafening clap of thunder. The electricity suddenly went out, plunging the house into complete darkness, only occasionally illuminated by flashes of lightning. The rain started suddenly like a wall. Its heavy drops were pounding loudly on the roof, and the wind was lashing the windows with such force that it seemed like the house was about to fly into the air. Samu made his way to the kitchen table by touch, found matches and lit a candle. The soft light wavered, reflected in her eyes, which continued to follow him with the same intense attention. Everything in that silence seemed different. Her silence, the sound of the rain, the dark corners of the room, the flickering light of the candle, all this turned the situation into something almost unreal. Samu put the candle on the table, but instead of leaving, he stayed close, realizing that his feet seemed rooted to the floor. He didn't know what was driving him at that moment, whether it was desire or something more complicated, but he couldn't take his eyes off her figure illuminated by the faint lightning. The gang seemed to sense it. She went to the fireplace, where there was a pile of firewood, and began to put it on the hearth. Her movements were slow and smooth, like a beast confident in itself. Samu watched her without taking a single step towards her. It was a strange, almost magical attraction that had fascinated him from the very beginning of their acquaintance, but now, on this night, when they were alone in the dark, it intensified to the limit. As the fire in the fireplace began to flare up, a soft light spread across the room, illuminating her face. She was sitting by the fire, hugging her knees with her hands, and looking at the flame, as if studying its secret meaning. Samu came up to her and sat on the floor next to her. They were both silent, and only the sound of crackling wood and the distant roar of the wind filled the house. He had never felt so strange. It seemed as if the whole world had disappeared outside these walls, leaving only the two of them in the center of the elements that raged outside. Samu caught her eye again. At that moment he felt the fine line that they had kept between them slowly begin to blur. The gang looked at him with the same expression with which a predator looks at its prey, but there was no threat in her gaze. It was something else, perhaps an attraction she'd been trying to hold back for as long as he had. Every moment spent together only reinforced this inevitable connection. Suddenly she got up, but she didn't go far. Her slender figure was illuminated by the fire, and his eyes followed her every move. She walked slowly to the window and, looking at the raging storm, said softly, almost in a whisper,
The storm will wash away everything.
Samu did not understand her words, but he felt their meaning. They were on the threshold of something inevitable, and this something defied reason. He didn't know what to do, but at that moment everything seemed unimportant. The world narrowed down to her silhouette, to those short phrases, to the crackle of fire and the distant rumble of lightning. They stood in the dark, surrounded by the sounds of nature and their own silence. It was clear, something will change soon. Samu felt that, despite all his efforts, he would able to resist for long what was already rolling over them like a wave. Time seemed to stand still, waiting for their decision, but none of them took the first step. The storm was raging outside the window, but inside, between them, another, deeper, more powerful element was brewing. Night fell on the house like a thick blanket, absorbing the last of the light. The storm was still raging outside, but now its roar became a background, something familiar, an integral part of this night. The gang was still standing at the window, watching the lightning cut through the inky sky, and each time her face was illuminated for a moment by a flash. Samu did not take his eyes off her, feeling something growing in him, something that had been hiding in the darkest corners of his Quina soul for a long time, but was now bursting out like a wild animal. Fire in the fireplace burned steadily, creating a cozy light in the house, but this comfort was deceptive. Everything inside him screamed that something unusual was happening here in this house, something he couldn't control. Samu was used to the silence, to the indifference between them, but now that his father was gone, when they were alone, this silence became different. It turned into a seething tension that seemed about to explode. He got up from the floor and walked closer to the gang. His steps were slow, almost hesitant, although he was not used to doubts. When he was with her, his mind often clouded. All the willpower, all the barriers he had built between them, melted in her presence. He tried not to think about being attracted to her, but it was getting harder by the minute. When he was behind her, so close that he could feel the warmth of her body, the gang, without turning around, said softly,
Do you hear that?
Her voice was barely audible, almost lost in the noise of rain and thunder. Samu froze, trying to figure out what she meant. His mind was too focused on her presence to grasp the meaning of her words.
A thunderstorm.
She continued, still looking out the window.
She's like us. It gains strength and then an explosion.
He felt cold goosebumps run over his skin at her words. Something in her voice aroused a strange feeling in him, a mixture of fear and delight. It was dangerous. It's too dangerous. Samu could have moved away, could have broken this moment, but instead he slowly reached out his hand to her shoulder. His fingers touched her skin, and he felt her tense under his touch. It was a barely noticeable gesture, but he felt a warm, almost scalding energy emanating from her body. They both stood motionless. The silence between them became unbearably thick, like a dense spiderweb entangling them. Samu wanted to pull his hand away, but he couldn't. At that moment he realized that there was no turning back. The gang finally turned slowly towards him. Her face was illuminated by the flickering firelight, and there was the faintest shadow of a smile on her lips. There was a question in her eyes, but she didn't expect an answer. They both knew that this moment was inevitable. Her eyes met his, and there was no fear in them, just a challenge. It was like a duel, where everyone was waiting to see who would make the first move. Samu looked at her without looking away. He felt something growing inside him that he had been trying to suppress for a long time. Everything that had seemed wrong to him before was now just an illusion. His hand was still on her shoulder, but now the touch felt different, more conscious, more meaningful. He didn't know what was driving him, but something inside him took over. The gang slowly raised their hand and placed it on top of his. Her fingers wrapped around his arm, as if locking him in this place, not allowing him to leave. There was something in her eyes, recognition, an understanding that they had both crossed the line a long time ago. At that moment there were no more words between them. Their silence spoke louder than any phrases could express. She took a step closer, and now their bodies were almost touching. The fire in the fireplace reflected in her eyes, giving them even greater depth, and Samu suddenly felt the ground slipping away from under his feet. Everything was gone. There was no home, no storm, no past. There was only this moment. He didn't know how long they stood there looking at each other. Time seemed to have stopped. Every moment, every touch was saturated with tension that was impossible to describe in words. Suddenly, the gang raised their hand and touched his face. Her touch was unexpectedly soft, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to break down that last barrier that Samu had been building between them for so long. He couldn't help himself. He leaned towards her, and their lips met. It wasn't a kiss full of passion. Like in novels, it was something more, quiet and deep, like a stream of water that moves slowly but inevitably. It was a moment that had been preparing for a long time, gathering all their tension, all that they had hidden from each other and from themselves. Samu felt her body responding to him, as she pressed closer to him, as if afraid that if they broke this kiss, reality would engulf them again. At that moment, they both forgot about everything. The world around them disappeared, leaving the two of them in this silence filled with the noise of a thunderstorm and the crackling of fire. He couldn't tell how much time had passed, but when they finally parted their lips, the gang took a step back. Her eyes were closed, and there was an expression on her face that she had never seen before. It was a mixture of relief and fear, as if they both understood that this step was irreversible. She opened her eyes and looked at him again. But now there was something else in her gaze, not just desire, but recognition. She knew that they had both gone further than they could afford. It was more than just a kiss. It was a decision they both made, even if they didn't say it out loud. Samu looked at her, feeling how hard it was for him to breathe. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, the blood pulsing in his temples. There was a whole hurricane of emotions raging inside him, but the main one among them was the feeling that there was no way back anymore. The gang looked away, but did not leave. She went back to the window, looking out at the storm raging outside. Her shoulders were tense, and Samu could see her chest rising and falling from deep breathing. He took a step towards her, but stopped. Now that this had happened between them, he didn't know what to do next. His whole being screamed that he needed to move forward, but deep down he knew that this step would change everything. Father. Thoughts of him came like a cold shower. It was wrong. All this time he had been trying to stifle these feelings, trying not to think about what was pulling him to this woman. But now that they had crossed that line, he couldn't pretend any further. The gang seemed to sense his inner struggle. She didn't say a word, but her glance over her shoulder said more than any phrases could say. There was understanding in her eyes, even if they both knew there was no turning back. Samu came closer. He was next to her, almost touching her shoulder. They both stood at the window, watching the storm tear through savannah, and each knew that the side beside them was even stronger. That was the moment when everything changed, and although neither of them said a word, they both understood that this step was the first, but far from the last. Everything ahead of them was covered in fog, but they both knew that from now on they were walking this path together. After that night, everything changed. Samu felt it with every cell of his body. The storm that raged outside the windows of their house was a thing of the past, but the storm that rose inside it did not subside. On the contrary, she was gaining strength, like a savanna after a rain, when every blade of grass stretches to the sky, greedily absorbing heat and moisture. Now that his feelings were out, he couldn't hold them back anymore. The sun rose over their house again, flooding it with golden light. The usual routine, working on the land and caring for cattle, continued as before. But Samu no longer perceived these days as before. Now his every step, every look was colored by something else, deep and unknown. He tried to return to his normal life, but realized that it was impossible. His relationship with the gang had become like brittle glass, ready to shatter at the slightest touch. They avoided each other throughout the day, both pretending that nothing had happened. But that was a lie. Every time he passed her, his body reacted, his heart was racing, his breathing became ragged. He felt her presence like a hot wind burning his skin. He noticed how she watched him from afar when she thought he wasn't looking. Her gaze, full of restrained fire, pierced through him every time. The gang became the center of the whole world for him, a magnet that could not be ignored. She was present in every moment of his life, in his morning awakenings, at work, in his night dreams. They didn't talk anymore. Every evening, when they sat in the house, the fire in the fireplace illuminated their figures, but there was a wall of silence between them. This silence was full of passion, tension, and unspoken words. Every moment spent in her presence was a test for herself. He could feel her eyes on him, feel her breathing quicken sometimes when they accidentally got too close to each other. The nights had become especially unbearable. When it got dark and they went to their rooms, Samu lay in bed, unable to sleep. His thoughts kept returning to the gang. He imagined her lying in the next room, her warm skin touching the cold sheet. It seemed to him that her breathing could reach him even through the walls. Sleep was becoming rare for him. Every night he tossed and turned, overcome by desires that were kindled inside him more and more every day. The gang had become something out of reach for him, but at the same time he felt it so close that it drove him crazy. Scenes of that night when they stood at the window flashed through his mind, when her touch seemed to burn him from the inside out. One night, when the moon illuminated the savannah with its cold light, Samu couldn't stand it. He got out of bed, crossed the room barefoot, and went outside. The night air was cool, and his feet sank into the soft dust of the earth. He walked to the edge of the garden, where old trees grew, their crowns whispering in the wind, like ancient keepers of secrets. The silence of the night absorbed him, but his thoughts were absorbed only by her. At that moment he heard a slight rustle. He turned around and saw the gang coming out of the house, barely visible in the moonlight. She was wearing a light cape, her long braids fell over her shoulders, and her silhouette seemed ghostly in the cold light of the moon. She didn't notice him right away. She moved smoothly, almost noiselessly, like an animal following the call of the night. Samu froze. His heart stopped in his chest, and then began to pound wildly. He couldn't take his eyes off her. She stopped at the edge of the garden and looked up at the sky. Her face turned to the moon, and her eyes reflected its cold light. At that moment she seemed to him something unearthly, unreal, like a vision from an ancient legend. He couldn't stand still. He needed to get to her. It was inexplicable, but he could no longer restrain himself. Every step was difficult for him, but his attraction was stronger. When he got closer, she finally noticed him. Their eyes met, and at that moment the same spark ran between them as that night. The gang did not move. Her gaze was serious, almost anxious, but she made no move to move away. Samu came so close to her that he could feel her breathing, and this moment was again beyond their tacit agreement. The fire inside him flared up with renewed vigor, and he could no longer fight it. She didn't move away, didn't make an attempt to leave. Her whole body seemed to reach out to him like a flower reaching out to the sun. At that moment, they both realized that they would no longer be able to live the way they were Kontia. It was the point of no return. Every moment spent next to each other only fueled the flames they were trying to suppress. Their nightly meetings became a secret ritual. They avoided each other during the day, trying to maintain a semblance of normality, but when night fell, when a whole world fell asleep, they left their rooms like ghosts, driven by the same craving. They didn't talk to each other at first. Their bodies spoke for them, their breath and touch replaced words. These nights were filled with passion, which they had been suppressing for a long time. Every moment spent together under the starry sky seemed forbidden, but that made it even sweeter. They hid from the whole world, finding solace in the dark. Under the cover of night, they were free from all rules and expectations. They met in different places, sometimes in the garden, among old trees, then by the river, where the water reflected the moonlight, then on a hill, from where the entire horizon was visible. There, on the edge of the savannah, where the sounds of the night mingled with the whisper of the wicks burned, they surrendered to their feelings, forgetting about everything in the world. Sometimes they lay together, looking at the stars, listening to the wind rustling in the branches of the trees, and the river flowing slowly in the distance. Their silence was more eloquent than any words. Every time they touched each other, it was like the first time something forbidden but inevitable. Their passion was a secret that they shared only with each other, and this secret connected them even more. The days passed slowly, as if the world had slowed down, allowing them to enjoy every second. But with each new dawn, Samu felt that their relationship was becoming more dangerous. They both knew it couldn't go on forever. One day the secret will be revealed, and then they will have to face the consequences. But for now they preferred to close their eyes to the future, enjoying what the night gave them. Every time they said goodbye before dawn, the gang would leave first, her silhouette melting into the pre-dawn silence, leaving her alone with his thoughts. He knew that it couldn't go on forever, that one day it would all collapse. But as long as they were together, he didn't care. The passion that united them was their secret, their little world hidden from everyone. And every moment they spent together seemed like a forbidden gift that they had stolen from time. The night plunged Savannah back into its velvet gloom. The moon, usually bright, disappeared behind clouds this time, as if nature itself was trying to hide from what was about to happen. Samu was already used to these secret meetings with the gang, to the way their bodies found each other in the dark, how their every gesture was filled with restrained desire, ready to tear the world of the familiar to pieces. That night he left the house before it was completely dark. The air was humid, almost sticky, and it creates the feeling that nature itself was holding its breath as before a storm. His footsteps were barely audible, but chaos reigned in Samu's heart. He understood that this could not go on for long. They were playing with fire, and the sparks had already started to fly. He walked through the garden and headed for the old hill behind the village, the very place where they had more than once found shelter under the starry sky. The ground was warm under his feet, even at night, and this contrast with the coolness of the air filled him with vague anxiety. Samu was sure that the gang was already heading here. Their meetings had become something inevitable, like a ritual that could not be interrupted. When he reached the top of the hill, everything was shrouded in thick fog. The grass was swaying in the wind, creating a slight rustle, and in the distance, somewhere, the cries of night birds could be heard. Samu stopped and looked around. The gang had not yet appeared, and he was left alone, standing on top of the hill, looking at the dark horizon line. The world around him was quiet, but a storm was raging inside him. Every evening spent with the gang seemed like a sweet but increasingly bitter forbidden secret. He knew that this mystery was devouring them from within, that they had locked themselves in a cage that they had built with their desires. However, this could not last forever. He stood and waited. Time passed slowly like pitch, and every rustle seemed to him a harbinger of her coming. And finally he heard the familiar light footsteps. The gang appeared in front of him like a ghost emerging from the fog. Her face was illuminated by the dim light of the moon that still broke through the clouds, and she seemed even more ethereal than ever. They did not touch each other, although each of them knew that touching was inevitable. Samu could feel this strange electricity in the air. It always appeared when they were around. His eyes met hers, and at that moment the world shrank back to the two of them. There was no one and nothing around them, only their own fine passion, hidden under the cover of night. But this time it was something else. This moment, this fog, this strange feeling in the air, everything told him that their secret would no longer be safe tonight. Samu felt it like a blade stabbing into his heart. He knew they had been seen. Maybe a casual glance from behind a tree, maybe a shadow that flickered for a moment, but someone was there. And this one knew. They both stood in silence, but that silence no longer seemed safe. It was heavy, oppressive, like a weight on your shoulders that you can't shake off. Samu felt his heart pounding in his chest. He had to do something, but what? Where to run if their secret is about to come out? And then he heard it. A soft sound, almost imperceptible, but to his ears it sounded like thunder. Someone was walking towards them. Shadows began to move between the trees, and Samu realized that they were no longer alone. They were found. He turned at the sound, and, as he had feared, saw a figure approaching through the thick fog. It was a neighbor, one of those who lived further away in the village. His face was grim, his features distorted by hatred and contempt. Samu froze. This is the end. They were caught red-handed. The neighbor stopped a few steps away from them, his eyes glittering in the dark, like the eyes of a predator that has found prey. He didn't say a word, but his look said more than any phrases. There was everything in that look: condemnation, anger, and most importantly, a threat. He knew what had happened between them, and now he had the power. Samu clenched his fists, feeling his blood boil in his veins. His whole being protested against that look, against the fact that they were now his prisoners. The gang stood nearby, her face like a stone mask, which reflected neither fear nor remorse. She knew that their lives had changed at that moment, but she didn't show any weakness. She had always been strong, and even now, when their exposure was inevitable, her inner flame did not fade. The neighbor slowly turned around and walked back to the village, his steps slow but determined. He knew that everything would change tomorrow. Tomorrow the whole village will know about their secret. Tomorrow their names will be on everyone's lips, and no one will give them a second chance. Samu and the gang will remain in people's memory as those who betrayed trust. Samu's father, Kifila, finds out about this, and his revenge will be ruthless. The two of them stood on the hill, watching the figure of their neighbor slowly fade into the fog like a ghost. And at that moment, Samu realized that there was no turning back anymore. Their world was collapsing right before their eyes, like a house of cards that had been built for a long time, carefully hiding from everyone. Silence enveloped them again, but now this silence was different. She was filled with fear, a premonition of inevitable reckoning. Samu and the gang no longer touched each other. They knew that their meetings were over now. Their bond, which was once a sweet secret, has now turned into a poison that poisoned their lives. They were ready for this moment, even if they pretended for a long time that they could avoid it. The night was almost over, but for them, a new day would not bring relief. They knew that the sun would bring with it only pain, condemnation and retribution for allowing their feelings to cross the line. Samu felt his body turn to stone again. Anger was building inside him, anger at himself, at the gang, at the neighbor, at the world that did not allow them to be together. He didn't know what would happen next, but his heart screamed with injustice. He wanted to run, hide, disappear, but he knew that it was impossible. Everything will change tomorrow. Their lives will never be the same again. They stood on the hill, silently looking at the slowly fading light of the night. There was only darkness ahead. Morning came, but its light did not bring relief. The shimmer of dawn only emphasized the cold reality that rolled over her like a merciless wave. He sat in his room, looking out the window, but saw nothing but the grey dawn, which slowly, like a lazy monster, devoured the remnants of the night darkness. His neighbor's footsteps still sounded in his head, fading into the fog. These steps now seemed to him a sentence, ruthless and inevitable. He knew it was only a matter of time before they were exposed. The hours dragged on like slow honey, but their secret could no longer remain in the shadows. Too many people had seen, too many rumors were already in the air. And now all this will explode, will fall on them with such force that it will be impossible to stop this flow. Samu got up and walked slowly across the room. His heart was thudding like a hammer on an anvil, and every beat was painful in his chest. He knew that his father would be back today. Waiting for this was like a trap they both fell into. Everything that had happened between him and the gang, All those nights filled with secret passion and sweet pain now seemed distant and unreal to him, like a dream from which he needed to wake up. The house was empty, like a frozen painting. The silence hung in the air, heavy and oppressive. The gang was somewhere nearby, but I wasn't looking for it myself. They both knew that words wouldn't change anything anymore. Their choice was made, their fate was sealed. Now all that remained was to wait for the end. When the sun finally rose above the horizon, Samu heard the distant roar of an engine. It was a sound that tore through the morning silence like a bell striking. My father was coming back. Samu felt a fear shackle his body. His mind screamed that it was time to act, that he needed to find a way to escape, but his body would not obey. He was standing at the window, looking out at the dusty road where an old car was slowly approaching. The wind was kicking up dust, creating the illusion of a storm, but the real storm had been raging inside him for a long time. The car stopped at the house and Kefila got out. My father looked the same as always, with the same confidence in every movement, with the same impenetrable expression on his face. But Samu knew that this time it would be different. He felt a dull rumble of fear grow inside him, as if something terrible was coming at him, which he could not resist. Kefila entered the house, and from that moment time slowed down. Samu could hear his every step, every sound that seemed unbearably loud in this oppressive silence. My father didn't know what would happen in a few moments, but he knew himself. He knew that when the truth came out, the world he and the gang had built around their secret could collapse overnight. Samu went out into the corridor. He saw Kefila inspecting the house, attentive to detail as always, but this time his gaze was strangely detached. Perhaps he had already guessed. Perhaps something in the air told him that something had changed here. At that moment Samu wanted to disappear into thin air, walk away and never come back. But it was impossible. Several hours have passed. As if due to the increasing tension in the house, the world around itself began to change. Soon people from the village came, one by one, as if it was a pre-arranged scene. They didn't come with good intentions. Their faces were frowning, full of condemnation. The neighbor who saw them that night has already told his version of events. And this version stirred up the whole village. A crowd gathered in front of the house. They stood there looking at Kefila, at the gang, at herself, as if they were criminals who had crossed the line. There was no compassion in that look, only contempt and hatred. In places like this village, secrets never remain secrets. There was no room for mistakes here, and everyone knew what would follow such a betrayal. Samu stood on the threshold of the house, feeling the tension in his throat. He didn't need to hear the words to understand what people were saying. Their looks said it all. Kefila came out of the house. His face was unreadable. He silently scanned the crowd, and then turned to Sam. There was no anger in his eyes. There was something worse, disappointment. Samu froze, unable to hold that gaze. He couldn't look at his father, couldn't stand what was going to happen next. But he couldn't leave either. This was the moment when everything that he and the gang were hiding had to come out. Their sins, their weakness, their love, all this was now under the gun of every look, under the condemnation of every word. Suddenly the gang came out of the house. She was standing next to Samu, her face calm, almost cold. She did not hide her gaze, was not afraid of condemnation. There was no guilt in her eyes, just a strange acceptance of what was about to happen. She knew that this day would come, and now that it has come, she did not flinch. The crowd began to make noise. The condemnation and hatred were obvious. People were whispering to each other, pointing fingers at them. The gang and Samu stood shoulder to shoulder, as if awaiting the inevitable verdict. But they couldn't run away from it. The father slowly approached them. There was no hurry in his movements, but his every step echoed in Samu's head. Kefila stopped in front of them. His face was like a mask, but behind that mask was pain. He looked at his son, then at the gang, and his gaze was full of disappointment. He knew that he had lost something important, something that could not be returned. Time seemed to have stopped. Samu stood there, feeling the whole world crumble around him. All his feelings, all his aspirations, his love for the gang, none of that mattered now. They were exposed. Their lives, their secret nights, were all meaningless in the light of what lay ahead. My father didn't say anything. He just turned around and left. It was the hardest blow. Anger would be easier to bear than this cold silence, this renunciation. Samu felt something break inside him, as if some important part of himself had disappeared from his life with his father's departure. The crowd dispersed. People left one by one, leaving them alone in front of the house. The gang didn't move. She was standing next to Samu. Her face was still calm, but the same storm was raging inside her as it was inside him. They both knew that everything would be different from now on. Their lives will never return to the state they were in before. When the last people disappeared over the horizon, and silence covered Savannah again, Samu realized that this was the end. But not the end he had once thought of. It was the end of their secret love, the end of their world which they had built on false foundations. Now they could only accept their fate. They were both looking into the distance, beyond the horizon, where the sun was slowly sinking. A day full of pain and loss was coming to an end, but the night would bring them no comfort. Now they were doomed to live with the consequences of their actions.